The hotel lobby glowed with polished marble floors and golden chandeliers, a place where power disguised itself as luxury. Washington, D.C. had many corners where influence was traded, but tonight this lobby seemed to hum with something more than casual chatter. The click of heels, the rustle of expensive coats, the murmur of businessmen and lobbyists blurred into a steady rhythm. Few noticed the three men who slipped through the revolving doors, blending into the tide of guests. At that very moment, Marcus Hill pushed his mop bucket across the far side of the room. He was used to this dance, his quiet presence against the noise of others' ambitions. At 48, with years of janitorial work behind him, Marcus had grown invisible to those who passed him by. But invisibility carried its own kind of power. He noticed everything. The worn tips of his shoes squeaked against the marble as he moved, and his dark eyes scanned the room with the subtle attentiveness of a man who had learned to survive by watching before acting. Marcus wasn't bitter about his job. He had made peace with it long ago. What unsettled him, however, was how easily people dismissed him, as though his uniform stripped him of identity. He knew names, voices, even the habits of frequent guests, but rarely did anyone know his. Tonight would be no different, or so he thought. Governor Richard Callahan was expected to arrive shortly. The name carried weight in Washington, and even more in the South, where Callahan's political career had been shaped. To some, he was a man of vision, to others, a man of stubborn principles. Either way, his presence drew attention. Security had already been doubled, aides paced with urgency, and whispers of policy talks floated through the air. Yet beyond the surface, an unease grew. The three strangers lingered near the entrance, moving as though they belonged, though their steps were too deliberate, their silence too heavy. Before the story unfolds any further, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss powerful stories like this, moments where ordinary people prove how extraordinary they truly are. Marcus continued his work methodically, dipping his mop, wringing it dry, then sweeping across the glossy floor. He thought about his mother back in Atlanta, how she used to say, "Do every job like it's worth a king's gold, because dignity doesn't come from titles but from effort." Those words had carried him through long nights and endless shifts. Tonight, however, dignity would soon collide with danger. A young waitress, Elena Torres, hurried past him carrying a tray of glasses. She offered Marcus a quick smile, one of the few staff members who treated him as more than background. "Long night, huh?" she whispered as she passed. "Same as always," Marcus replied softly, returning the smile. Across the lobby, Daniel Reeves, the eager doorman, barely in his 20s, adjusted his tie nervously. He had dreams of one day working in government himself, though for now his role was opening doors for men who already held it. He often sought Marcus's advice, admiring the older man's calm demeanor. Tonight Daniel gave him a quick nod from across the lobby, unaware of the storm about to break. The clock above the concierge desk struck the hour. Conversations dipped momentarily as the revolving doors spun again. Governor Callahan stepped into the lobby, his presence commanding but weary. His aides surrounded him, their voices rising and falling like waves. To the public eye he appeared untouchable. To Marcus, however, there was something fragile about the man, a tension in his jaw, a heaviness in his shoulders. As Callahan moved forward, Marcus's gaze drifted back to the three men by the entrance. Their eyes locked on the governor with unsettling precision. Marcus didn't know their purpose yet, but something in his chest tightened. He gripped the mop handle a little firmer, the weight of unspoken responsibility pressing against him. What Marcus didn't realize was that this ordinary evening, in this grand lobby filled with voices and ambition, was about to demand something extraordinary from him. His quiet life of unnoticed work was about to collide with history itself, and every instinct inside him whispered that nothing would ever be the same again. Marcus Hill's days followed a rhythm that most would find monotonous, yet for him it carried weight. He rose before dawn in his modest apartment on the east side of the city, the kind of place where buses hummed past cracked sidewalks and neighbors exchanged nods more often than words. His kitchen table bore unpaid bills stacked neatly, a silent reminder of the life he was holding together. Though weary from long hours, Marcus greeted each day with the same stubborn determination he had inherited from his parents. At the hotel, his shifts stretched late into the night, cleaning after banquets, sweeping cigarette butts from corners near the back exit, polishing railings until they gleamed, none of it glamorous but all of it necessary. What weighed on him wasn't the labor, but the constant reminder that others walked past without even a glance. Guests would thank the valet, compliment the concierge, but Marcus blended into the walls. Still, he noticed everything: the businessman's nervous tapping fingers, the politician's forced laugh, the hurried whisper between two aides who thought no one was listening. One evening during a short break, Elena Torres approached him in the staff corridor. She balanced two steaming cups of coffee, her dark eyes full of warmth. "You'll fall asleep standing if you don't drink something," she teased, handing him one. Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "You always seem to know when I need a boost." Elena shrugged, her apron stained from hours of service. "You remind me of my father. Worked double shifts just like you. Said tired bones were better than an empty table." Her words struck him. He often thought about his own father, a factory worker in Atlanta, who had taught him that respect wasn't handed out. It was earned. But earning it didn't mean you'd be seen. Not far from them, Daniel Reeves finished greeting a group of guests at the front doors. Later, he drifted toward Marcus, excitement buzzing in his voice. "Did you hear? The governor himself is coming tonight. Imagine being close to that kind of power." Marcus gave a small smile. "Power isn't what you see on the surface, son. It's how a man carries himself when nobody's watching." Daniel frowned, considering those words. He admired Marcus not just for his work ethic, but for his grounded wisdom. Unlike others who dismissed the janitor, Daniel often lingered to ask questions, hungry to learn. In quiet moments, Marcus reflected on his life. His job didn't pay enough to cover everything. His daughter's college tuition loomed heavy, and he sent what he could back home to his mother. He stretched dollars the way others stretched time, making every one count. Yet despite the pressure, he took pride in the simple dignity of finishing what he started. The hotel itself mirrored the inequalities Marcus felt daily. Guests waltzed in wearing tailored suits and designer shoes, their laughter echoing through halls lined with portraits of long-dead statesmen. Meanwhile, Marcus and his co-workers moved behind the scenes, unseen gears in a grand machine. He accepted his place, but some nights he wondered if he was destined to be nothing more than a shadow in other people's stories. That thought lingered as he watched Elena joke with a busboy, or Daniel stand straighter each time a powerful guest passed by. They both carried ambition, hers to eventually open a small cafe, his to step into politics. Marcus had no such dreams left. His were tied up in making sure his daughter had the chance he never did. Still, there was a quiet strength in him, one forged through years of being underestimated. He knew how to read a room better than most, how to sense tension where others heard only laughter. It was an instinct born from survival, sharpened by years of labor and invisibility. On this particular evening, as guests filed into the lobby with careless chatter, Marcus felt that instinct stir again. Something subtle, almost hidden beneath the noise, unsettled him. He brushed the thought aside, focusing on polishing the brass handles of the elevator. Yet, deep inside, he knew better than to ignore that quiet tug at his awareness. The night still seemed ordinary, but within the hum of conversation and clinking glasses, Marcus's unseen world was about to brush against forces that would no longer allow him to remain invisible. The revolving doors turned slowly, and the low hum of conversation in the lobby shifted into a ripple of whispers. Governor Richard Callahan stepped inside, with the ease of a man used to being noticed. Tall, with silver threading through his dark hair, he wore the kind of suit that spoke of wealth, but carried the wrinkles of a long day on the road. His presence had gravity. Aides clustered around him like satellites, each speaking at once, pressing folders and phones toward him. Marcus paused mid-swipe of his mop and watched discreetly from across the lobby. To him, Callahan looked less like a powerful figure and more like a weary man cornered by demands. There was a tightness in his expression, the kind that came from years of smiling for cameras while bracing against unseen battles. Guests leaned toward one another, murmuring with excitement. "That's him," someone whispered, pointing subtly. A pair of lobbyists hurried over, adjusting their ties as though preparing for a stage performance. Callahan, however, barely registered their presence. His eyes carried the shadow of exhaustion, his stride firm but heavy. "Governor, the schedule has shifted," an aide said quickly. "You'll need to meet the donors before the dinner." Callahan waved a hand impatiently. "Not now, Tom. Just give me 5 minutes without a briefing." His voice was low, commanding, edged with fatigue. Marcus recognized that tone. He had heard it before from men trying to mask vulnerability with authority. The governor's public image was polished, but in person Marcus saw the cracks. The slightly hunched shoulders, the quick glance around the room as though gauging every angle. At the front desk, Eleanor handed over a set of papers to a guest, but found her eyes flicking toward the governor. She leaned slightly toward Marcus as she passed him. "He looks human," she whispered, almost surprised. Marcus offered a small smile. "That's because he is. Power doesn't make a man less tired than the rest of us." Daniel, standing near the door, nearly vibrated with energy. As the governor crossed the lobby, Daniel straightened his jacket and greeted him with a crisp, "Welcome, Governor Callahan." Callahan gave him a brief nod, eyes already moving to scan the crowd. For a moment, those eyes lingered on Marcus. The janitor lowered his gaze quickly, though he felt a flicker of something, curiosity perhaps, that passed in the governor's look. The aides tightened their circle again, discussing logistics, their words clashing over one another. Callahan rubbed the bridge of his nose, muttering, "Always noise." Never silence. It was a rare moment of honesty, audible only to those close enough to hear. Marcus caught it, and for reasons he couldn't quite explain, it stayed with him. Behind the commanding image was a man worn down by responsibilities that few could imagine. Around the room the atmosphere shifted. The wealthy donors leaned in with predatory smiles, eager to secure a word. Hotel staff kept their eyes down, balancing trays and rushing to keep up with the rhythm of demand. For Marcus, the governor's entrance wasn't just another event. It carried weight, though he couldn't yet name why. He dipped the mop into the bucket, wrung it out and returned to the floor. But his mind lingered on the man now moving deeper into the lobby. A part of him wondered if people like Callahan ever noticed the ones who scrubbed the floors beneath their polished shoes. The governor's laugh, forced and thin, echoed faintly as he responded to a donor's joke. Marcus frowned, sensing something behind it, the same way he could sense a storm before the first raindrop fell. It wasn't the man's politics that drew Marcus's attention, it was his humanity, hidden beneath layers of performance. And though the janitor couldn't yet understand why, a quiet instinct told him that the weight of the night was pressing toward this very moment, and that his own path, long unnoticed, was edging closer to colliding with the governor's in ways neither man could foresee. The flow of the lobby carried on, guests drifting in and out, conversations rising and falling like tides. Yet amid that rhythm, 3 figures moved with a different purpose. They entered separately, but with the same calculated composure, as if rehearsed. To most eyes they were unremarkable, just 3 more men stepping into the warm glow of the hotel. But to Marcus, who had long trained himself to notice what others ignored, they were a disruption in the natural current of the room. The first man, Lucas Grant, was broad-shouldered with the solid frame of someone who had spent years in construction or labor. His heavy boots struck the marble floor with weighty steps. He wore a dark jacket zipped high despite the mild autumn night, his jaw clenched as though he carried impatience in his bones. He drifted near the entrance, eyes scanning each person who passed, never lingering too long, but never truly at ease. Carl Benson, the second, carried himself with a subtler tension. Slender, his movements were precise, his gaze sharp and restless. He adjusted his cuff repeatedly, a nervous tic betraying what his stiff posture tried to mask. He positioned himself closer to the central seating area, where he had a clear view of both the governor and the exits. The third, Damon Lee, younger than the others, had the look of someone trying too hard to blend in. His smile flashed briefly at a concierge, but it lacked warmth. He checked his phone without typing, as though using it as a prop. He stationed himself near the elevators, keeping his distance yet aligned with the others in a silent triangle. Marcus slowed his sweeping, eyes narrowing. Something about the way their attention cut through the room unsettled him. Most guests wore expressions softened by wine, chatter, or fatigue. These three wore focus, intense, unyielding, as though rehearsing steps in a play no one else knew was happening. He glanced toward Elena, who was busy setting down fresh drinks at a nearby table, her laugh carrying lightly above the clatter of glasses. Daniel stood proudly at his post, still buzzing from the governor's entrance. Neither seemed to notice the men. Marcus bit the inside of his cheek, wondering if his mind was working overtime, inventing stories where there were none. Lucas brushed past a guest too abruptly, muttering a curt apology before retreating to his place near the door. Damon tapped the side of his leg impatiently, while Carl leaned against a column, eyes flicking between Callahan and the hallway leading deeper into the hotel. Marcus's instincts tightened further. He remembered his father telling him once, "Trouble doesn't always scream, son. Sometimes it just waits in silence until no one can ignore it anymore." That silence now seemed to echo louder than the chatter around him. From across the lobby, the governor remained unaware, caught in a half-hearted conversation with a donor who praised his latest campaign speech. Callahan nodded politely, though his gaze drifted toward the grand staircase, clearly wishing to escape the noise. Marcus gripped the mop handle harder, his chest tightened with a mix of doubt and certainty. He wasn't trained in security, wasn't in any position of authority, but he couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. He saw details others missed, the stiffness of their shoulders, the way they subtly aligned themselves, the deliberate choice of heavy jackets in weather that called for none. His gaze darted back to Elena. She caught his eye briefly and raised her brows in question, but Marcus forced a small shake of his head. He didn't want to alarm her, not yet. He shifted closer to his mop bucket, pretending to wring out the mop again. But his focus was fixed elsewhere now. These men weren't here by chance. Whatever their purpose, it orbited around Governor Callahan like a shadow waiting to stretch further. Marcus told himself he could be wrong, that maybe they were nothing more than guests with restless habits. Still, a voice deep inside refused to be silenced. Something was out of place, and whether anyone else realized it or not, the night was bending toward something no one expected. Governor Callahan moved steadily through the lobby, shaking hands with donors and nodding at guests, his practiced smile doing little to hide the fatigue in his eyes. His aides trailed close, each whispering reminders, schedules, and requests. The atmosphere buzzed with a mix of admiration and expectation, but beneath it all, a thin current of unease grew stronger. Marcus, standing a short distance away with mop in hand, kept his gaze fixed not on the governor, but on the three men who had settled into their positions. Their presence, subtle yet deliberate, seemed to tighten the air. He felt it in his gut, the way a man feels the shift of weather before a storm. The moment came quietly. As Callahan approached the center of the lobby, Lucas Grant stepped forward, his broad shoulders blocking part of the governor's path. His tone was casual, almost friendly, but the placement of his body spoke louder than words. "Governor Callahan," Lucas said, his voice low and steady. "We've been waiting to speak with you." One of the aides frowned and moved to intervene, but the governor, perhaps eager to appear approachable, lifted a hand. "It's fine. What's on your mind?" His smile tightened, more performance than sincerity. At that instant, Carl Benson shifted slightly, positioning himself just off to the governor's side, while Damon Lee adjusted near the elevators, effectively closing the space around Callahan. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like coincidence, three concerned citizens eager for a word. But Marcus knew better. He had seen enough restless guests in his years of work to know when a conversation wasn't casual. The governor's security detail lingered nearby, but their eyes slid past the men. To them, it appeared harmless. They had witnessed pushy constituents before, angry voices, raised complaints. Nothing about these three, at least at a glance, screamed danger, but Marcus saw what they didn't. Lucas's hands never left the pockets of his jacket. Carl's eyes darted not at the governor, but at the exits. Damon, though feigning distraction with his phone, mirrored every movement of his companions with silent synchronization. Marcus's heartbeat quickened. His palms grew damp against the wooden handle of the mop. He told himself he might be imagining it, that suspicion could twist reality when you were tired enough, yet his instincts screamed otherwise. The governor cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, if this is about policy, I suggest you contact my office. Tonight isn't the time." Lucas tilted his head, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "And with respect, Governor, tonight is exactly the time." Marcus shifted his stance. He glanced at Elena, who hovered near the edge of the room with a tray, her brow furrowed in confusion at the tone of the exchange. Daniel stood a few steps from the door, unaware of the subtle trap forming. The bodyguards glanced briefly but didn't step closer, one of them muttering, "Just constituents." Harmless? Marcus nearly ground his teeth. Harmless was the last word he would use. He felt the weight of indecision pressing down on him. He was just a janitor. His duty was to clean floors, not to interpret threats against a governor. If he spoke up, he risked ridicule or worse, being accused of overstepping. But silence carried its own weight. He remembered his father's voice again, stern yet steady. "Son, a man isn't measured by the noise he makes, but by the choices he makes when nobody expects him to." Marcus's chest tightened. He stood at the edge of something larger than himself, watching power and danger collide in front of him. Every instinct inside screamed that the moment was shifting. Still, he stayed rooted to the spot, mop in hand, wrestling with the question that burned in him. Was it his place to act, or would he remain invisible as always? Marcus stood motionless, mop in hand, watching the tension coil tighter around the governor. Lucas's presence was a wall, Carl's gaze was a hawk, and Damon's restless movements seemed to echo the rhythm of unease in Marcus's own chest. The security detail, blind to the subtleties, hovered nearby but failed to step closer. To them, nothing was wrong. To Marcus, everything was. His throat tightened as he weighed his choices. He was a janitor, not a bodyguard, not a man whose opinion carried authority in this polished lobby. His role was clear: clean, stay quiet, fade into the background. Yet his instincts screamed at him to see more, to act before silence became regret. He remembered the long conversations with his father back in Atlanta, sitting on the porch during humid summer nights. His father's voice was steady, the kind that left no room for doubt. "Marcus, courage isn't about being loud. It's about standing tall when every part of you wants to shrink. There'll come a time when you'll feel smaller than the world around you, but if you step forward anyway, that's when you'll know what kind of man you are." That memory pressed against him now. His father had been a factory worker, proud yet scarred by years of being overlooked. He had fought for dignity not in grand gestures, but in daily persistence. Marcus carried that same persistence, but tonight demanded something more. The conflict churned inside him. He wanted to dismiss the thought that three strangers could be dangerous. Maybe they were simply passionate citizens. Maybe the weight in Lucas's jacket pocket was nothing more than a folded letter. But deep down, Marcus didn't believe that. He had worked in this hotel long enough to know the difference between anxious businessmen and calculated intruders. Eleanor caught his eye from across the lobby. Her brow furrowed, and she gave the slightest shake of her head, as though asking if he noticed what she noticed. Marcus looked away quickly, unwilling to drag her into the storm that built inside him. Daniel, on the other hand, stood tall at his post, eyes flicking occasionally toward the governor, admiration painted across his young face. He hadn't noticed the men at all. Marcus envied that innocence, the kind of blindness that allowed belief in the order of things. He lowered his gaze to the marble floor, the reflection of the chandelier shimmering in the mop water. His stomach tightened. The world didn't expect him to interfere. If he stayed quiet, no one would blame him. No one would even know he had noticed. Yet silence carried a weight heavier than shame. The governor's voice rose slightly, calm but edged with irritation. "Gentlemen, I cannot discuss policy here. This is neither the time nor the place." Lucas smirked faintly. "Sometimes, Governor, the time and place aren't yours to choose." Marcus's pulse quickened. His grip on the mop handle left his knuckles white. He shifted his stance, caught between duty to his job and duty to his conscience. Every second stretched, louder than the chatter of the crowd, louder than the clinking of glasses. He thought of his daughter, studying late nights, believing in a world where justice mattered. What would he tell her if something happened here and he had stood aside? Could he look her in the eye and say he had done nothing? Fear pressed on him, heavy and suffocating. He feared ridicule if he acted. He feared danger if he stepped forward. But most of all, he feared the hollow silence of regret. The governor's aides whispered frantically, the bodyguard still unconvinced. Marcus inhaled slowly, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and expensive cologne. His heart pounded with the clarity of a man standing at the edge of a decision that could not be undone. And though doubt still gnawed at him, Marcus knew one truth: invisibility was no longer an option. The governor's aides spoke over one another, their voices colliding as they tried to steer him toward the grand staircase. Yet Governor Callahan, stubborn and visibly annoyed, held his ground in front of the three men. Marcus's eyes never left them. Every detail, the angle of their shoulders, the way they shifted weight from one foot to another, etched itself into his mind like signals on a warning board. Then it happened. Lucas shifted his jacket slightly, and for the briefest moment, the fabric gaped. To anyone else it might have been nothing, just the movement of a man adjusting his clothing. But Marcus caught the unmistakable outline of something concealed beneath. His breath caught, his stomach dropped. He glanced quickly around the room. Elena moved between tables with practiced grace, though she looked uneasy, sensing the tension without fully understanding it. Daniel, still near the door, held his posture proudly, greeting new arrivals with bright energy. Neither of them saw what Marcus saw. The realization crashed over him like cold water. He wasn't imagining it. He wasn't overthinking. Something dangerous was hidden under that jacket, and it was inches from the governor of the state. Marcus's pulse thundered in his ears. The air felt heavier now, each second stretching into a lifetime. He wanted to believe security would notice, that someone else would act. But the guards still lingered on the edges of the room, distracted by the crowd, blind to the silent storm building around their charge. "What do I do?" Marcus thought, gripping the mop so tightly it trembled in his hand. His mind raced, caught between instinct and fear. He had always been the man in the background, the one no one saw. Was it his responsibility to step into the light now? His father's voice whispered in his memory again. "You'll face moments where silence feels safe, but safety at the wrong time makes a coward. You weren't raised to be a coward, son." Marcus swallowed hard, the weight of that truth pressing down on him. Across from him, Lucas leaned in closer to the governor. His voice was too low for Marcus to hear, but the smirk curling on his lips made Marcus's skin crawl. Carl shifted as well, positioning himself slightly behind Callahan, while Damon's restless energy grew sharper near the elevators. Marcus knew he had only seconds. He looked at Elena again. She caught his stare, confusion flickering in her eyes as if she sensed his alarm but couldn't decipher its cause. She tilted her head slightly, a silent question. "What's wrong?" He shook his head ever so slightly, not daring to expose his suspicion openly. He couldn't risk her panic drawing attention too soon. Daniel called out cheerfully as another pair of guests entered, oblivious to the tightening noose around the governor. His youth, his innocence, his belief that the world was orderly and safe, it made Marcus's heart ache. Daniel didn't yet know how quickly life could twist. Marcus's breathing grew shallow. He replayed the image of the concealed item in his mind, the shadowy outline pressing against the jacket's fabric. It was no mistake. No ordinary citizen carried such a thing into a hotel lobby. His conscience battled fiercely with his fear. If he acted and was wrong, he would become the fool, the janitor who overstepped, perhaps even lose his job. But if he stayed silent and he was right, if harm came to the governor, he would never forgive himself. The seconds ticked louder in his mind. Every instinct screamed that the time for hesitation was over. He had to choose. Marcus exhaled slowly, steadying his nerves. His eyes locked once more on the men surrounding the governor, and with clarity sharper than fear, he realized one undeniable truth: the responsibility was his. Marcus's chest heaved as if the air itself had thickened. His thoughts clashed in violent rhythm, every reason to stay still warring with every reason to move. The weight of the mop in his hand, once a tool of routine, now felt like the only barrier between hesitation and action. His instincts screamed, louder than his fear. Do something, now. He forced himself forward, pushing the mop bucket across the polished floor, the wheels squeaking faintly. To anyone watching, he was only a janitor doing his job, slipping unnoticed through a sea of people. Yet every step was calculated, each one moving him closer to the governor, and the three men tightening their invisible circle. When he reached the edge of their formation, Marcus bent slightly, wringing the mop into the bucket with exaggerated effort. The water sloshed loudly, drawing a glance from Carl. Marcus lowered his gaze, feigning embarrassment, as though apologizing silently for intruding on important men's space. Then, with deliberate precision, he tilted the bucket just enough for water to spill across the glossy marble. The liquid spread quickly, a sheen gliding outward until it reached the polished shoes of Lucas, the broad-shouldered leader. Lucas shifted instinctively, stepping back to avoid the slick. His heel skidded slightly, and his hand jerked toward his jacket in reflex. That tiny motion was all it took. "Hey, watch it!" Lucas barked, his voice sharper than he intended, his composure cracking under the sudden slip. The sound drew eyes. Guests glanced over, startled. Eleanor froze mid-step with her tray, her heart visibly lurching in her chest. Daniel frowned at the disruption, taking a hesitant step forward. Marcus straightened quickly, hands raised in mock apology. "I'm sorry, sir. Clumsy hands tonight." His voice was steady, though his pulse roared like a drum in his ears, but his ruse had worked. The shift of Lucas's jacket revealed more than Marcus had hoped for. A faint bulge at his side caught the attention of one of the governor's aides. The aide's eyes widened, his breath catching. He whispered harshly to a guard, "Look at his jacket." The bodyguards, slow to react before, now moved with sudden urgency, their gazes sharpened, hands drifting toward their earpieces. The air snapped taut, the casual hum of the lobby collapsing into thick silence. Carl noticed the change immediately. His jaw tightened as he muttered, "We've got eyes." Damon, still near the elevators, stiffened, his fake smile evaporating as he edged closer to the group. Marcus's heart slammed against his ribs. He had crossed the line, exposed them just enough to unravel their disguise. For a brief second, fear clawed at him. What if they turned on him first? What if his act painted a target on his back? Lucas's glare snapped to Marcus, suspicion flashing in his eyes. "You," he began, his voice low and venomous. But the words were cut short as one of the guards stepped firmly between Lucas and the governor. "Sir, I need you to step back." His tone was commanding now, stripped of doubt. The sudden shift in dynamics unsettled the intruders. Their casual cover had fractured, and in the small crack, the truth began to bleed through. Marcus stood motionless, mop handle gripped tight, forcing himself to breathe evenly. He had acted not out of heroism, but out of necessity, and now the entire lobby seemed to pulse with the weight of what came next. Guests whispered, their voices rising into a nervous murmur. Eleanor set down her tray carefully, her eyes darting to Marcus with a mix of fear and awe. Daniel, confused but alert, edged closer to the governor, as if his youthful loyalty demanded he do something, anything, to help. The moment teetered on the edge of eruption, and though Marcus had not spoken a word beyond his feigned apology, his single decisive act had shifted the balance of the night irreversibly. The guard's command cut through the hum of the lobby like a sharp blade. "Sir, step back." His voice was steady but firm, his body angling protectively in front of Governor Callahan. The shift drew instant attention. Guests glanced over nervously, their conversations fading into a low buzz of uncertainty. Lucas's face tightened, his jaw flexing as if he weighed whether to retreat or push forward. His companions stiffened, subtle coordination flickering between them. Carl's eyes darted to Damon, who shifted uneasily near the elevators, his hand twitching by his side. The triangle they had formed began to collapse under scrutiny. Callahan blinked, confusion flashing across his features. He turned slightly toward his aide. "What's going on?" The aide leaned close, whispering urgently. "Governor, we believe there may be a weapon." The governor's eyes widened, his controlled mask faltering for just an instant. "What?" His voice dropped to a harsh whisper, laced with disbelief. The security detail moved quickly now, their hesitation evaporating. 2 guards flanked the governor, guiding him backward while another stepped directly toward Lucas. "Sir, I'll need you to raise your hands." Lucas sneered, his composure cracking. "You've got it wrong," he said, his voice dripping with false indignation. "I'm just here to talk." But his body betrayed him. The slight shift of his weight, the tightening of his grip inside his jacket, it was enough. The nearest guard barked, "Hands where I can see them!" The air snapped with tension. Guests gasped, some stepping back, others frozen in place. Elena pressed herself against a wall, her tray abandoned on a nearby table, her wide eyes fixed on Marcus, as if silently asking whether he had known this all along. Daniel, trembling but determined, moved closer to the lobby entrance, ready to assist if chaos spilled outward. Marcus stood rooted, his mop handle clutched like a lifeline. His chest rose and fell in quick bursts, sweat beading at his temples. He had done what instinct demanded, but now the weight of it pressed on him. If things erupted, if violence shattered the fragile order, he knew lives, including his own, could be forever changed. Carl's voice sliced through the thick silence. "Governor, all we want is your attention. Step aside and we'll explain." His tone was calm, but his eyes glimmered with something darker, calculation, desperation. "Attention doesn't require a weapon," one of the guards shot back, his hand hovering near his holster. The governor, shielded now behind a wall of security, straightened his shoulders. His voice carried a rare steel. "This conversation is over. Move them out." For the first time, Lucas faltered. His eyes flicked to Carl, then to Damon, whose youthful bravado seemed to crumble under the sudden spotlight. The plan they had clung to dissolved in the face of trained security and a crowd now watching intently. The guards pressed forward, their stance unyielding. One grabbed Lucas's arm, pulling it free from his jacket. The moment his hand was exposed, empty but trembling, the tension cracked further. Carl raised his hands reluctantly, though his glare burned with unspoken fury. Damon hesitated a beat too long before mimicking the gesture, his chest heaving. The guests exhaled in a chorus of whispers, though fear still clung to the air like static. The governor was hustled a few steps back, his aides shielding him with urgency. Through it all, Marcus remained silent. He had no title, no authority, but he understood what had shifted. His deliberate spill of water, a janitor's clumsy accident to anyone else, had forced the truth into light. Lucas, caught between resistance and surrender, turned his eyes on Marcus. It was only a flicker, but it was enough. The look carried recognition, a silent acknowledgement of who had disrupted their plan. Marcus's breath hitched. He had changed the course of the night with one act, but the weight of that choice had only begun to settle. The lobby, once filled with polite laughter and the clinking of glasses, now trembled under a heavy silence. Guests whispered in clusters, their voices carrying sharp edges of fear and speculation. Some craned their necks for a better view, others clutched their coats as if ready to flee. The golden chandeliers above seemed to shine colder, as though the light itself sensed the tension that lingered. Governor Callahan was escorted swiftly toward a side corridor, his aides close behind. His face remained taut, composed for appearances, but the tight set of his jaw betrayed what had just passed. To the onlookers, the drama was clear enough. 3 men had threatened power in the very heart of the hotel. Yet the truth, the detail that had sparked it all, remained invisible, just like the man who had made it happen. Marcus stood with his mop and bucket, hands trembling faintly though he tried to mask it. He lowered his gaze as if focusing on the wet streaks across the marble, blending back into the background he knew so well. The guards, now barking orders into radios and restraining the intruders, didn't glance his way. To them, Marcus was nothing more than a janitor resuming his task. Elena's voice, soft but urgent, broke through the hum. "Marcus." She touched his arm lightly, her dark eyes wide with both fear and admiration. "I saw what you did. You—" She stopped herself, glancing at the guards. "You can't just fade back into silence after this." Marcus shook his head quickly, his expression tense. "Keep your voice down, Elena. Nobody needs to know." Her brows furrowed. "Nobody? You diverted them long enough for security to react. If you hadn't—" He cut her off gently. "I did what anyone with eyes should have done. That's all." From across the lobby, Daniel hurried over, his youthful energy shaken but still intact. His voice carried excitement he struggled to contain. "Marcus, I swear I saw it. The way you spilled the water. That wasn't an accident, was it?" "You knew." Marcus's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't answer directly, but the silence was enough. Daniel grinned despite the tension. "Man, you can't hide this. You just saved the governor. People should know." Marcus's chest tightened. "People don't notice men like me unless it's to blame, Daniel. Remember that." His tone was low, edged with the kind of tired wisdom that came from years of being overlooked. The young doorman shook his head, refusing to accept it. "Not this time." Meanwhile, the intruders were led out, their heads low, but their eyes burning. Lucas, restrained and surrounded, cast one final glance toward Marcus. It was brief but sharp, as though marking him, acknowledging the unseen hand that had shattered their plan. The look carved itself into Marcus's memory, leaving a chill he couldn't shake. The police arrived minutes later, their radios crackling, their boots echoing against the marble. Guests shuffled nervously aside as officers took statements from staff and bystanders. The energy shifted from fear to gossip, voices rising with exaggerated retellings of what they had seen. Yet through all the noise, Marcus's name was never spoken. He bent down, wrung out his mop, and swept across the water he himself had spilled, his movements methodical, almost ritualistic. The act steadied him. The irony wasn't lost. He had caused the disruption, and now he erased its traces, returning the floor to order as though nothing had happened. Elena lingered near him, arms folded, her eyes fierce. "You can't just clean this away, Marcus. Not this time. Someone has to speak for you if you won't." Marcus didn't meet her gaze. "Let them think what they want. The governor's alive. That's what matters." Yet deep inside he felt the stir of something he couldn't quite name, an unease not only from Lucas's glare, but from the silence that followed. He had acted, but the world had already begun to forget him. And as the lobby slowly returned to its rhythm, Marcus sensed that his quiet decision carried consequences far greater than the water now drying beneath his mop. The following hours passed in a blur of flashing lights, reporters' questions, and the hum of police radios. By the time the night faded into early morning, the hotel lobby had returned to something resembling normalcy, though the air still crackled with the aftermath. The guests, once buzzing with quiet excitement, had settled into their rooms, but the city beyond was awake, digesting the news. The story of the attempted attack on Governor Callahan was already a headline, broadcasted across televisions and social media feeds. But Marcus's name was nowhere to be found in the narrative. He finished his shift, exhausted and drained, but still moved through the hotel with the same quiet routine he had always known. No one had spoken to him directly about the events. Not the police, not the security team, not even his fellow staff. It was as if the moment of his action had been swallowed by the larger drama, a footnote in a story that had already moved on. He passed through the kitchen, where Eleanor was wiping down counters. She glanced up as he entered, her eyes filled with a quiet concern. "Still no mention of you," she said, her voice low. Marcus nodded, continuing his task as if the comment hadn't struck him. He hadn't expected anything else. "They'll catch up, Marcus," she added, more hopeful than she felt. "Someone has to say something, right?" He didn't reply at first, his eyes scanning the kitchen as he continued to sweep the floor. It wasn't the first time he'd been invisible, but something about tonight felt different. His hand paused on the handle of the broom, and his mind returned to the look Lucas had given him, the silent acknowledgement. Marcus had interrupted their plan, but now, without recognition, it felt like nothing had changed. His mind wandered back to the lobby, to the brief moment when the intruders had been caught and restrained. He had acted swiftly, but he wasn't a hero. He was just a man who had seen a danger no one else had recognized until it was almost too late. That feeling, The one he had hoped would be filled with pride instead rested with a dull, gnawing uncertainty. In the break room, Daniel sat watching the news on his phone, eyes wide with disbelief. "Can you believe it?" he muttered, half to himself, half to Marcus. "The news is saying the governor's life was saved by a quick response from the security team, but they're barely even mentioning the 3 men who attacked him." Marcus's chest tightened. He had known the story would shift this way. The truth was never as neat as the headlines. He could hear Daniel's voice continue, excitement still riding the edges of his words. "But you, man, you were the one who distracted them. You saw them, Marcus. You should have been on the news for this." Marcus sighed, sitting down on the edge of the table. He looked at Daniel, his eyes clouded with exhaustion. "It doesn't work like that, kid." His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. "The world doesn't see men like me, it never does." Daniel looked puzzled, his youthful optimism struggling to match Marcus's tone. "But this time it should. You did something important." "Important to who?" Marcus's words were sharp now, not out of anger, but out of something deeper, something that had been building inside him for years. "What do they care? The governor's fine, security's fine. You think they'll remember me?" He shook his head slowly, as if shaking off the thought altogether. "No, son. They'll forget. They always do." Daniel opened his mouth to argue, but Marcus stood up, cutting the conversation short. He knew Daniel meant well, but the truth was simpler, harder to bear. Back in the lobby, the only sign that something had happened was the faint smell of cleaner in the air, lingering like a ghost of the chaos. It would be cleaned up in time, forgotten in the hustle of the next political event, the next news cycle. The quiet, unnoticed act of one man saving another would fade, slipping away like water into the cracks of the floor he'd scrubbed. For now, Marcus could only move forward, keeping his eyes down, his head low, blending back into the routine he had known for so long. The days following the incident at the hotel felt like a haze to Marcus. Life continued with its usual rhythm, predictable and unremarkable, though something had shifted beneath the surface. The story of the attempted attack on Governor Callahan had played out across every major news outlet, but it was as if Marcus had never existed in it. He had done the unthinkable, intervening at the precise moment when the unspoken plan had nearly unfolded, yet now his name was as invisible as it had been before. He continued his work without fanfare, moving quietly through the hotel, cleaning, mopping, polishing, everything and nothing at once. His actions, once unnoticed, had saved a life, but it seemed no one cared to remember who had made that difference. The hotel staff spoke of it in hushed tones, but the deeper he slipped into his routine, the clearer it became. Recognition was an illusion, one that was not meant for people like him. Elena, who had been his only ally in the aftermath, had tried repeatedly to get his attention. One afternoon she caught him near the employee lounge. Her face was flushed, her brow furrowed in determination. "Marcus, you can't let this go." He had only just sat down on a bench to rest, but Elena didn't let him get comfortable. "I heard they're calling the security team heroes, but no one's talking about how you stopped them. You need to tell someone what you did." Marcus sighed, his tired eyes reflecting the weight of her words. "I already told you, Elena. It's over. They're moving on to the next story, and so should we." But Elena wasn't satisfied. "But you, Marcus, you saved the governor. That's more than just doing your job. You deserve to be recognized for that." He shook his head, the lines on his face deepening. "Recognition doesn't change anything. It's just words, a headline, a moment that'll fade the next time something else happens. It doesn't matter to them. It doesn't matter to me." "Why not?" Elena pressed, her voice edged with frustration. "Why are you so determined to remain invisible?" Marcus looked away, the faintest shadow crossing his features. "Because that's all I've ever been. Invisible. To them, to the world. It's easier this way." She stood there for a moment, speechless, as though trying to absorb the weight of his words. Finally she sighed, crossing her arms. "You're wrong about that. Maybe it's easier, but it's not right." The conversation left Marcus more unsettled than he expected. Eleanor's words lingered in his mind as he returned to his work. He had never craved recognition, never thought it was his place, but now, standing in the middle of the same polished floors he had cleaned for years, the emptiness of invisibility began to feel suffocating. Meanwhile, Daniel, full of youthful energy, continued to preach Marcus's heroics to anyone who would listen. But his admiration wasn't enough. The public had moved on. The news cycle had turned its focus elsewhere, and Marcus, like so many others in the shadows, was forgotten again. It wasn't just the public's disregard that gnawed at him. It was the internal struggle, the growing itch of wanting something more, even if it was fleeting. He wanted recognition, but more than that, he wanted the satisfaction of knowing that someone, somewhere, understood the magnitude of what he had done. As the weeks passed, his internal battle raged on. Elena's words were not forgotten, but Marcus buried them deeper, where they couldn't disrupt his steady routine. Still, there was an underlying shift in him, a quiet longing for something he had never allowed himself to want, the acknowledgement that he mattered. But the struggle to reconcile who he was with what he had done weighed heavily on his soul. The world had moved on, and so had the hotel guests, but Marcus could not simply move on. The cost of his invisible courage had left him restless, searching for something that seemed just out of reach. He had been overlooked his entire life, but now, for the first time, he wondered if it would always be that way. Governor Callahan sat in his private office 3 days after the incident, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across his desk. The usual flood of documents, briefings, and emails waited for his attention, but he hadn't touched any of it. Instead, he sat in silence, watching the muted footage on a screen before him, security camera footage from the hotel lobby. The governor had been briefed repeatedly about the attempted attack. His aides praised the vigilance of his security team. The narrative was clean, efficient, and politically convenient, but something in him had resisted believing it was the whole story. He replayed the footage for the 4th time. The camera angle wasn't ideal, positioned high and far from the central action, but it was enough. He watched himself walk into the lobby, saw the men begin to close in, and then saw something strange, a hotel janitor moving in with a mop and bucket, pausing just long enough to spill water near the group. He leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. In that moment, the energy of the lobby shifted. One of the men stumbled slightly, revealing something under his jacket. The chain reaction unfolded exactly as he remembered it, but now, in watching it, Callahan realized something unsettling. It hadn't been security that acted first. It had been the janitor. Callahan called for Tom, his senior aide. "Get me everything you can find on this hotel employee," he said, pointing to the frozen image of Marcus on the screen. "Name, background, anything." Tom blinked. "The janitor." "Yes," Callahan replied firmly. "The janitor." Within the hour, a folder was delivered to his desk. Inside, a single sheet of paper bore Marcus Hill's name, a photo, and a few lines of HR details. No accolades, no complaints, just shift schedules and salary. Callahan read the file slowly, then leaned back, his mind turning. Tom re-entered the room. "Do you want us to issue a statement? We can include him in a broader thank you to hotel staff." The governor's jaw tightened. "No, not in a general thank you. If we acknowledge him, we do it right." Tom hesitated. "There's already a narrative in place. Shifting it now might raise questions about gaps in security, about how close we came." Callahan looked away from the file, out the window. "That man acted when my security didn't. He risked his life with nothing to gain. I won't let that be buried under a press-friendly version of events." Tom sighed. "It could complicate the political message." "I'm not interested in the political message right now," the governor said, his voice colder. "I'm interested in telling the truth." Later that evening, as the governor sat alone in his residence, he thought about the look on Marcus's face in that grainy footage. Calm, controlled, deliberate. Not a man caught in the moment, but one who chose it. He found himself wondering what kind of life shaped that kind of courage. A man with no spotlight, no protection, choosing to step into danger because no one else had. Callahan wasn't an emotional man by nature, but something about this stirred him. For all his speeches about dignity, hard work and service, here was someone who had lived those words more fully than he ever could. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Make arrangements for a public address," he told his press secretary. "I'm making a personal statement. And make sure that Marcus Hill, is invited." As he hung up, he stared again at the photo in the folder. There was no reason this man should have known what was coming. No training, no duty to intervene, and yet he had. Governor Callahan leaned back in his chair, something shifting inside him. Politics could wait. Gratitude, when overdue, carried more weight than applause delivered on time. And he would make sure the world knew Marcus Hill's name. The press conference room was packed, a blend of reporters, cameras, and aides, all waiting for Governor Callahan to take the stage. The usual tension of such an event hummed in the air, but today there was something different. The lights were brighter, the questions sharper, and the anticipation carried an undercurrent of curiosity. What was the governor about to say? Marcus stood at the back of the room, his uniform neat but his posture rigid. He wasn't used to being the center of attention. He had slipped quietly into the venue, unnoticed by most, his presence nearly invisible in the throng of political figures and press. But today, he was there, waiting for something that felt both surreal and inevitable. Callahan stepped onto the stage, his usual political composure in place, but his eyes were harder than Marcus had ever seen them. There was a stillness about him now, an unspoken weight that seemed to grow heavier with each step. He approached the podium and adjusted the microphone, the sound of his movement echoing across the room. "Good afternoon," the governor began, his voice steady but tinged with something deeper. "Thank you for being here today. We are here to address the events that transpired earlier this week at the Washington Grand Hotel. As many of you know, the incident involving my security team and a group of intruders could have ended much differently if not for quick action. But I'm not here to simply praise my security staff." A few reporters exchanged puzzled glances, unsure of where this was going. Callahan paused, letting the moment sit. His gaze scanned the room, settling briefly on the back corner where Marcus stood, barely visible. Marcus felt the weight of that glance like a physical presence. His heart began to race, but he forced himself to stay still. His eyes cast downward, as if blending back into the background would somehow shield him from the spotlight. "This is about a man who risked his life for mine, and for many others in that lobby," Callahan continued, his voice firm now, carrying an unshakable certainty. "A man who, without hesitation, saw something others didn't, and chose to act when no one else did." Marcus's breath caught. He felt the eyes of the room shift toward him, a sudden collective focus that made his skin prickle. He looked around, half expecting the reporters to turn their attention elsewhere, to dismiss the idea as part of a speech, nothing more than political theater. But the silence in the room suggested something different. "This man," the governor said, his tone almost reverential, "is Marcus Hill." The room was still for a beat longer than Marcus could bear. The reporters began to murmur, their pens and cameras moving as they tried to capture every word. The governor continued, his voice unwavering. "Marcus Hill is not part of my security detail. He's not a politician or a public servant. He's a janitor, and without him I would not be standing here today." A wave of tension rippled through the crowd, some reporters stunned, others skeptical. But Marcus, standing at the back of the room, felt the weight of the truth in those words. They were simple, direct, and they felt real in a way that nothing about his life had ever felt before. Callahan paused for a moment, allowing the gravity of what he had said to sink in. Marcus saw what others didn't. He understood what was happening in that lobby before anyone else. And when it counted, he did something about it. For that, he deserves not just our thanks, but our recognition. The room erupted into a quiet buzz. Questions began to fly, but Callahan raised a hand, signaling for silence. "We'll take your questions in a moment. But before we go any further, I want to ask Marcus Hill to come up here." The sound of footsteps echoed through the room as Marcus, still unsure of himself, slowly began to walk forward. His heart pounded in his chest, his body moving as though it were on autopilot. As he approached the governor, the room fell into a tense silence. Callahan extended his hand. "Thank you, Marcus. You've given us all something to aspire to." For the first time, Marcus looked into the governor's eyes and saw not just the weight of politics, but the sincerity of the moment. And for the first time, he felt seen, truly seen, as more than just a janitor, more than just a shadow in a room full of light. The cameras clicked, the flashes capturing the brief but significant moment of recognition. It wasn't the applause that mattered. It wasn't the acknowledgement that was important. It was the fact that in that instant, Marcus Hill had become something more than the world had ever allowed him to be. And as the room buzzed with questions and attention, Marcus, despite the chaos around him, stood taller than he ever had before. The ceremony ended with a quiet dignity that Marcus hadn't expected. There were no blaring trumpets, no parades, just a long handshake, applause that filled the room like rising water, and then silence. An almost sacred silence that spoke more than any speech ever could. He stood beside Governor Callahan, blinking under the bright lights, unsure of where to look, unsure of what to feel. The cameras continued to flash, but Marcus wasn't thinking about the headlines. He was thinking about the mop still waiting for him back at the hotel, about Elena's determined voice, about Daniel's belief in him, about his daughter, somewhere watching, maybe even proud. When it was over, the governor pulled him aside, away from the crowd, the noise, the eyes, just the two of them. "I meant every word," Callahan said, voice softer now, stripped of its political polish. "I've met a lot of people in my life, Marcus. Most of them spend years trying to be seen. You spent years being invisible, and yet, when it counted, you stood taller than any man in that room." Marcus shifted his weight, still unsure how to accept such words. "I didn't do it for recognition, Governor." Callahan nodded. "I know, that's why it matters even more." They spoke only a few more words, but they stayed with Marcus long after the cameras had turned off. That night, back in his apartment, he sat at his kitchen table with a bowl of cold soup and the news playing quietly in the background. This time, when they told the story, they said his name. Marcus Hill, a janitor from Washington, D.C., acted with instinct and courage when others stood frozen. His intervention saved lives, perhaps even the life of a governor. He turned down the volume and smiled to himself. Not because he needed their praise, but because something had shifted. The world had seen him, and even if it forgot again tomorrow, he would remember what he had done. Elena called that night. Her voice was bright with pride. "I told you," she said, laughing. "You can't keep sweeping away moments like that forever." He chuckled. "Guess I'll need a bigger mop." Daniel sent a message too, just a simple photo of the press conference with the caption, "Legend." For Marcus, it wasn't about being a legend. It was about knowing that when history brushed past him in a hotel lobby, he had chosen to reach out and leave a mark, quietly, without asking permission. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the hotel as usual. Same uniform, same routine, but people looked at him differently. Some nodded respectfully, others smiled. And though he didn't need it, he accepted it, not out of pride, but because it meant something had finally changed. One of the younger staff members approached him during break. "Mr. Hill, can I ask you something?" Marcus looked up. "Sure." "What made you act? How did you know?" He paused, considering, then said, "Sometimes you just know. And when you do, you either step up or you live wishing you had." The young man nodded, clearly moved. Before returning to work, Marcus stepped outside. The air was crisp, the sky wide and open. He looked up, breathing in deeply, feeling not like a man who had been seen, but like a man who had always known who he was. And that, perhaps, was the greatest recognition of all. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more true, powerful stories like this, where courage comes from the most unexpected places. And if you want to hear what happened next to Marcus Hill and Governor Callahan, click on the suggested video now on your screen.